Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. I think we had a really interesting session this morning. Lots of useful information, and now we've got some sessions will take us up to lunchtime. Just a couple of sort of things to sort of mention as far as things like Slido is concerned. The number that you need to be able to access putting Slido questions is #2446154. I think there might have been a number missing earlier on, but it's #2446154. And if you're into doing things in terms of social media, then Twitter is #ThinkDigid. So we're now going to have a session that looks at what the lessons can the public sector learn from the private sector digital identity initiatives. Susan Morrow is unwell, so we have a panel session, and we'll have Chris Tate, who's Chief Executive of Condatis, Jim Slevin, who's the Regional Director of ReadID by Inverid, and Clare White, who is Public Sector Account Manager for Okta, and we'll have a discussion. So I'll go and join. So, on the basis of what you've sort of not your existing knowledge or knowledge of sort of public sector and private sector initiatives, private sector initiatives, what do you want to try and get out of the day? What sort of things are you looking for that you'll hear about public sector and private sector and be able to learn from?
Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
Well, interestingly enough, I think a lot of the themes that have been discussed today are some key areas that I bump into each day when I'm talking and working with our government customers. So there's probably two key areas for me: collaboration, which we've touched on, and which is obviously the theme of this panel. And it's looking how we look at sort of how private sector work with users, citizens. We're all consumers of various services, so we are also the citizens that our government are trying to reach out to as well. And we've got experiences and we've got likes and dislikes. So I think the collaboration that we can take from private sector to public sector means that we can hopefully, allow our government customers to work in a cohesive way quicker. And I think choice, because certainly as an individual, again, I know what good identity looks like, I know what not so good identity looks like, and many of those good experiences develop in the private sector. So let's take the learnings from there. Let's, accelerate how we can make all of our public sector services as easy to use and as interoperable, which again is another theme that's been coming through this morning.
And I'm sure we'll drill down into those, further in this session. Jim, would you go along with that?
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely go along with that. It's best tradition of Britishness of going in a queue, isn't it? I certainly agree with that. I think there's a couple of things I'm really interested in getting out of the day. The first one is understanding the similarities and differences between the public and the private sector when it comes down to identity, certainly in terms of its verification and then authentication. And building on that, the second point is the key difference between a foundational identity. So what is the starting point for everything that we do in terms of identity, be that digital or physical, from that point on? And I think that for me is one of the fundamental differences that I'd like to tease out today.
Okay, fine, thanks very much. And Chris, what's your
at the end of the queue here?
Last but not least,
I think that it's really interesting to hear the challenges that government have. We're I guess all with slightly bated breath to hear what the Chancellor comes out with, but I think that the purse strings are going to be tighter. And I guess listening to those people who are involved in government procurement, the constraints that they're going to be working within, and those constraints I think are always common in the private sector. There's always a budget holder or a CFO in the background saying, well, show me the value. And I think what's really interesting for the digital identity sector is it can often be a cost benefit. The investment in a high quality identity access management solution can actually overall provide cost benefits. You know, the One Login project, I'm sure, has a view of how it will streamline and make things more efficient. So I guess my hope from today is to hear from those leaders in government departments how they are challenged around some of their budget responsibilities and delivering digital transformation, and then what learning points we might be able to sort of garner from working both in public and private sector, and are there common streams which help to deliver those?
Mm-hmm. I mean, Clare, you have a public sector role from a sort of point of view. You've probably seen a lot in terms of, you know, public sector initiatives around sort of digital identity. What are the sort of key issues that you think we need to sort of focus on? I think you're telling me, I think, like choice is obviously a key area.
Yeah, very much.
Citizen-centric.
And I guess it's sort of trying not to sort of group everything together. It isn't one size fits all. And what I mean by that is that certainly in our experience, there is some great work being done across government at department level. There's also some great work being done within those departments with the arm's length bodies. And they have an opportunity to move a little bit quicker, be a little bit more agile. And our message to them, as any of my colleagues' messages would be as well, is all around open standards. It doesn't have to, you don't have to go down a particular journey in its entirety. You know, it could be that you take some steps and you build some partnerships and you integrate some tools along the way. So being very standards based should give us an opportunity, I think, to evolve into what we want tomorrow to look like. We can't predict. I mean, the world of identity, the world of technology, just the economy, everything is changing drastically. So we've got to be open to change, and change is always in a better place when you partner and when you've got collaboration.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jim, you go along with that?
Yeah, I'd certainly go along that. And standards, I mean, we supply both to public and private sector. We do it in the UK and globally. And we have to work to a large number of standards. So one of the small difficulties with standards is take your pick. There's so many of them. And I think it was really interesting seeing Nick's presentation earlier about, you know, trying to coordinate all of those particular pieces, which I think is really important for interoperability globally going forward. In terms of standards for us as an organisation, I carry one around, you know, in my pocket.
I wonder when you're going to get that prop out. Yeah.
Which is my prop, the passport, and that is the closest that we've got to a foundational identity, particularly within the UK, notwithstanding 6 million that don't have a foundational ID. And obviously a number of them are driving licenses which don't necessarily have a secure identification chip within them. But the notion is, I'd agree entirely that the standards are there and we have to operate to them. But I think we have to be a little bit careful with some of those standards. So the interpretation of them, and it's interesting being in Institute of Civil Engineers. So you think, okay, so to borrow and probably mangle a quote from Winston Churchill, we shape buildings, thereafter buildings shape us. And it's absolutely true for policy, for frameworks. When you start to put a strategy together and you put frameworks and standards in place, people will follow them. So you have to be really clear that they're the right standards to follow. So, and bringing it down to a micro level for a moment, I went through an onboarding journey last week. And within that onboarding journey, it asked me to produce 2 documents. One was a utility bill and one was something else. In this case, I used my passport. So my passport has the most secure authentication mechanism globally accepted sat within it, which is a chip. It's not been broken. It's as secure as it gets. ICO 9303, if you want to get into the standards of it. But that wasn't used. What was used was a photo of it that would be visually or optically inspected. And the reason it was done in that manner is because the standard said you only really need to go to a medium level of security around this. So we forego the opportunity to be able to do a stronger and better user experience because the standards, the building, has shaped us to what particular manner that we go forward. So I think we have to be really thoughtful about those standards that we use and the way that we use them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Chris, you were making the point, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in government today, with a sort of chance of sort of statement. You know, how does 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪 help us sort of save money?
It's a really interesting point. When we get engaged with clients, often they have maybe a predetermined view of what the outcome they want to have. And I, with my colleagues, we always try to encourage as much scoping of what the art of the possible is and what that overall architecture might be. Standards absolutely play a part, whether it's, you get technical with sort of SAML or OIDC, there's W3C standards on decentralized identity, and things are coming. And we had a really robust and interesting dialogue with a very large client yesterday in the Microsoft headquarters in London. And what they're saying is where we want to consider what's going to be available in the next 2 to 3 years, but can you tell us what's going to be available in the next 10 to 15 years? And I'm not a futurologist, and nor do I have a crystal ball. But what they were really interested in is what's here now, and can we validate it and verify that there are standards based around that and they're making a good technical decision. But back in my dim and distant past, thinking about engineering, I come back to what I was termed many years ago the iron triangle of time, quality, and cost. And one might choose to change the word quality for risk, because most cases when we're making an investment decision, be it in a home-based scenario, but more importantly on a large-scale government or enterprise investment, you're wanting to make sure that those are going to, you can do it fast and you can do it cheap, but it won't be good quality. So, you have to make some very tough decisions, and I appreciate I'm not the budget holder in these cases, but what we look to do is making those discussions with clients is to understand what of those 3 axes they want to vary. And I come back, actually, in my view, sometimes the opportunity to make a good decision in an identity strategy at the architecture stage can enable you to actually maybe shrink that triangle, and you can do it a bit quicker, a bit better, a bit lower cost, and higher, as Jim was saying, just make sure that you maximize the availability on the risk profile.
Yeah, interesting point. Claire, one of the things that we were talking about was collaboration. I know that you're doing some work around that sort of area. Do you just want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of collaboration piece comes in a few shapes and sizes. But I guess one of the projects that we're involved with at the very early stages is scoping out a journey of a particular user from a particular environment to an environment that they would like to be in, in a given period of time. And when I was thinking about sort of the conference here today, I was thinking, if we look at the services that citizen or that person takes along the way, there's lots of collaboration between private sector and public sector, whether that's around housing or benefits or training, employment. So what I am always keen to understand when we're engaged with any of our clients at whatever stage of engagement we're at with them is, what does collaboration look like for them, either with other departments, if there's joint services that they're delivering, or collaboration with partners like ourselves who could be supplying an element of the technical journey for them. And again, I go back to the sort of the choices and the standards-based piece, in that we are not looking to engage with our customers because we have all the answers, because we don't. The world of identity is evolving at such a pace, and it's got so many influences, both within the UK and outside of the UK, as we heard earlier, that we've got to be very mindful of. So it is all about partnerships and collaboration. And having early discussions is not a commitment to procure. We're not sort of taking people down the journey and saying, we're only going to talk to you about this subject because we think we're going to get this at the end of it. We just want to talk around the subject and experience, what is going on within our customers' base and see how we can help.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I'm sure we'll probably make some questions about sort of collaboration, as we go on. Jim, so how do we get to this foundational ID?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, and building on the the notion of collaboration. I think collaboration, particularly in the authentication space, you can see that the public and private sector are suffering from exactly the same problems. I think it was described earlier in Gavin's presentation around the work that's going on in Scotland, and I know that's the same within the UK space. So those issues are very similar. There is a real difference, though, when it comes round to verification, which is the private sector, and it also appears now the public sector are struggling to get that foundation identity. That's the piece that's kind of missing, which is what is our starting point that says this identity, Jim Slevin, exists and is real, and then we can associate all of the attributes with that individual. And that piece is something that the private sector are desperate for. So it does exist in some places. Again, it is not entirely inclusive. With the risk of opening up the national ID debate, which I don't suppose anyone in this room would want to get into, and we certainly won't call it a national ID, please. We lost lost in the court of public opinion 5 years ago, as was described. And the court of public opinion is the media, frankly. But we lost that point because, dare I say it, my opinion is we got greedy. So, and I look at that from a private and a public sector that said it was starting to turn into this big monster of doing everything, rather than what's really, really needed, critically needed, which is a government-backed identity verification. So there is some point that you can say that identity we know exists. That is the closest thing we've got to it at the moment in the UK. We work with a number of European companies where there's an ID card, and that makes it simpler in some respects. But nobody is always going to have that specific identity card policy in place. If you go to Germany, who for very good reasons will never do a national identity scheme, and understandably so, given history, they are creating state-based identities. So it may not be national, but it is state. That foundation, if you look at the successful, I'd say, collaborations and the successful deployments around digital identity from It's Me, Bank ID within Scandinavia, you can even take it out to Singapore with SingPass. The one thing they all had at their heart was a foundation ID, and it can run decentralized. There it is. You can take that wherever you need it. But the notion is you can have a relatively decentralized piece if you don't try to grow it into some element.
I think it was Chris, you were talking about the importance of decentralized ID and citizens having control of their own ID parameters, and why not sort of go down that path?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and I mean, Nick's presentation this morning was fantastic because it gave us all a refreshment on the where things are happening in a centralized space, and being mindful of whether it's pan-European with the 𝗟𝗘𝗧𝗢𝗥, or in other nation states. There are some groundbreaking things happening in Canada, in Estonia, in New Zealand, and people are trying to make a point of it. But actually, let's go props. I've got a wallet here, and I choose where I show my Tesco card or other aspects. And I love the idea that the Linux Foundation is going to move forward, considering about wallets, because we at Good Artists, we're not in the business of wallets. We just unashamedly we implement Microsoft solutions. Microsoft's a pretty big organization, but they don't like to bring technology to market until they know it's has a level of maturity and readiness. But we were going through some stats yesterday. The Azure Active Directory has 100 billion authentications every day. It's like, that's pretty robust, that's pretty substantial. And at the moment, that some of that is moving through in a centralized space, and people want to have federated and centralized information. But why? Why should we necessarily trust that identity that we hold, that attribute, and only allow a government or an organization? I mean, I'm sorry, maybe being a bit off topic here, but I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk to have that piece of data and use it in a safe manner. If I have that, and I know it's on a potentially a distributed ledger technology, and I then choose the points at which I make that available, whether it's a passport, a driving license, a loyalty card, or to make a transaction, I think that would probably, particularly in the UK, and we are relatively libertarian and sometimes, dare I say, untrusting of government, maybe that would re-engage the citizens to have a higher level of trust if they believed that they had real control over their identity. The technology is moving forward. As I say, there are a number of working groups, and I think it's great that if we're looking at the comparison of public and private sector, we are aware, a number of private sector companies, there's a lot of investment looking in the art of the possible of what could come. And I think decisions are often made in a political scenario in a 2 to 3 to 5 years. Is it possible for a government to take a decision which would have a longer term required timeline, which might then make a better use of technology, which is still in the development stage?
Mm-hmm. We had a question come in, it's an interesting one. The question is, it feels to me as though the public and private sector needs are fundamentally different. Do the panel agree? How would you react to that?
Can I jump in? Because I think actually, I know people didn't have a chance to ask Nick some questions, and I'm sure he'll probably ask, but for me, his presentation hit that right on the nail. There isn't a single solution required here. There will be information that the Home Office or HMRC are going to want to have centralised and controlled and constrained. And from a private sector, we can't argue with that. There may be things happening in GCHQ which are very sensitive, and they need to be held in a nation state. But fundamentally, a lot of that identity information can be with individual. And if they are able to track a similar set of metadata, which enables interoperability, and that is one of the key words in identity, that interoperability, I think that's the answer. So they are different, but they have to be able to mesh.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jim?
Yeah, I think the answer to the question depends on the lens that you're looking through. So if you're looking through a lens of single sign-on for users into government services, no, that's no different to a user having single sign-on to multiple different applications sat within a corporate entity. If you look at a lens from identity verification, as I've said, I do think there's a fundamental difference, because there is one which is the state saying this person exists versus a private entity saying, I think this person exists. I think that to me has a difference around that particular lens. I agree entirely with, but I have nothing but empathy and sympathy for people who are having to work with changing ministerial and prime ministerial focus almost on a daily, let alone 5-yearly sort of basis. And I think that perhaps is slightly different at this moment in time, at this particular juncture in history, but hopefully that can move on quickly.
Do you agree?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think we've sort of heard through the presentations this morning a lot of information that's supporting that particular question. I guess for me, if I sort of boil it down to a fairly simple level, is the services that I'm trying to access and trying to use across a range of government departments. I'm a citizen that also has those interactions, those digital journeys, both in my personal life as well. So the difficulty for government is that it's got to move at a pace that keeps up with what's happening in the private sector. And that private sector, and we obviously saw that accelerated through the pandemic, but that just accelerated what was coming anyway, that we were going to have more of an online presence. So I think working closely and understanding with parties that are very heavily entrenched in that private sector, why wouldn't you want to make use of that information, that data, that user behaviour information? It's all there and it's available, and we should be using that to shape where we go in our public services.
That's a good point. Any questions on the floor? There's one just here. Yeah.
Can I just make an observation and invite comment? I get wound up when people talk about foundational identity, because it's quite possible for one individual, one carbon-based life form, to be a dual national, for example, and have a French identity and a British identity. In other words, there is no single foundational identity. There are many identities. Every identity is simply an attribute or set of attributes. And the only real definition of foundational identity is the way in which you authenticate with 1, 2, or 3 factors to some point in the cloud space. Everything else then is attribute transfer. Is that not true?
I think, as I mentioned foundational identity, then I should answer that particular one. I think there's probably a need around the lexicography that we're using for that particular piece. So foundational identity, in the way that I was describing it, was the ability for attributes to be associated with an individual. So I think that's a slightly different definition. I don't disagree with the notion that you could have multiple foundational identities. So on the basis that says this is a government, this is a state that says who you are.
To associate attributes with the individual, that implies you have different organisations communicating in the back office to work out which attributes apply to which government identity. Another view is you go for a smaller definition of government and allow the individual to pick up the attributes online, as it were, from different organisations. Government ceases to be monolithic. Government just becomes the NHS, the different education providers, the HMRC, etc. They're all different organisations, and they all provide attributes to the individual, which the individual can release back to other organisations.
Yeah, if I pick up on that briefly, though, I think you're right, and maybe one of the challenges that we are all facing right now is when we look at government gateway or verify and they didn't work, perhaps, was that because they were trying to look for the one size fits all? If we think that what's going to be required for an HMRC tax return is not going to be the same as what you may need to get a prescription from your doctor, why would you want to make sure that the NHS and HMRC are necessarily linked? And I agree with you, the attributes that you then obtain, from my point of view, are yours, and then you make them presentable as and when it's required for the goods or services that are being accessed at the time.
And yes, we agree. And if I can add one further point, projects like One Login always start off with enormous ambitions, saying they're going to do one login for central government and then local government and then the NHS, etc. It goes on and on and on. And then over time they realise that in fact people don't really want to do one login with a very large organisation comprised of all of those relying parties kind of merged together. The prime requirement, or an early requirement for One Login, should be to define the limit of its ambition, as in whether it does just central government, HMRC, DWP, or whether it does other things as well, because that's vital to allow the rest of us to get on with our jobs.
Let's finish on one point here. It's a good point that's been made here. There's a good point about language and recognising the need for multiple changing and non-conforming identities. Would you go along with that idea?
I think the identity space is changing. I think the conformance, from my point of view, still comes back to standards. And it's
standards, aren't we?
What's been great is there's been a number of consultations that the DCMS have been running. We take part as well on the same ones with OAX, and hearing government asking the questions of industry of how they would like that trust framework to be. I think if we talk about conforming identity standards, they're not fixed. They're going to develop and evolve. I think what's important is that dialogue to happen. And as my two colleagues on the stand here have said, it is about partnership and consultation and keeping that conversation open.
Final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think what I sort of started at the beginning around sort of collaboration and around choice, and I think that echoes into that question and all of the sort of answers that we've been sort of discussing around today.
Lovely, Claire. And Jim, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, I think just in terms of, differences between private and public sector, one of them is private sector will fail early in what it does, and it will trial and it will move forward, and that's accepted. So it doesn't have to start out with a grandiose specification of what it's going to achieve. It will start off probably with a vision, but it will adapt and it will move forward. And I don't think we give government, public sector, the opportunity to do that. We expect it to be fully defined, fully inclusive from day one. And that's incredibly difficult, if not impossible to do. So are we setting up to fail?
Okay. Chris, Jim, Claire, thanks very much for your time. Great insight, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.